Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and here we break down complex issues around health, the climate crisis, and social justice through a vegan lens. We'll talk about the magic link between your well-being and the planet's health, because luckily, choosing a healthier, mindful lifestyle for yourself often creates healthier vibes for our planet too. Staying consciously clueless means getting to show up knowing nothing, but staying open to all that you can learn. From feasting on plant-based meals and reducing waste to learning to meditate, every step you take contributes to your wellness and makes systematic change for the world. You can make a difference. This podcast will show you how. I am truly honored to be chatting with you today.
Oh, thanks. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And thanks for having me and for all you're doing to help educate and inform and empower people who really care about their impact on the world and their own lives.
I appreciate that because your work has done that for me, and I know for many others, I'm not alone in that. So there's a lot of questions. I have notes, I have thoughts, I have things to chat about, but I would love to start with your vegan journey. What got you there?
Yeah, thank you. In some ways, the vegan part of my journey was the first part, although I do come from like a long line of, family members who were quite politically, very socially concerned, you could say, very concerned with social issues and wanting to have a positive impact on the world. So that was some of the backdrop of my life. But my journey started probably, in childhood. I've told this story before. Like many people, I grew up with a dog who I loved like a family member. And I also grew up eating meat, eggs, and dairy on a regular basis. And throughout so many years and so many meals, I just never thought about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand.
I know.
Right? I ate a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent and conscious and sentient as my dog. But I just didn't connect the dots. I didn't make the connection, right, between the meat on my plate and the living being it once was. And all that changed in 1989. I was 23 years old at the time, and it was the 80s. Things were quite different. And I got really sick after eating a contaminated hamburger, and I wound up in the hospital on intravenous antibiotics.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And they closed the burger joint that I had eaten down actually after that.
Sounds like the right choice.
And I became essentially a vegetarian by accident, right? I just stopped eating meat. I stopped eating meat after that, not because of any like conscious sort of ethical decision I had made, but more like I was just so disgusted by the last thing I had eaten before getting so violently ill. And I was like, oh, it was a greasy burger. No. So I became essentially a vegetarian by accident. And then I had to figure out like what to cook for myself, how to shop. And this, of course, led me to learn about animal agriculture, recipes or whatever. This was before the internet, actually. And so I learned about animal agriculture. And what I learned just completely shocked and horrified me. It horrified and shocked me, right? I could not my brain around the extent of harm and suffering with non-human was happening to the environment, human health issues. I ended up meeting somebody who was a vegan who then talked to me about the dairy industry. And I was like, and then I stopped eating dairy, became vegan, and just was like so horrified and so shocked what I was learning. But what shocked me in some ways even more than what was that no to information was willing to hear what I had to say. They would always respond by saying things like, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal, or they'd call me like a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And these were my friends and my family members. They were socially conscious people. There were people who definitely cared about animals and would never want to cause harm to them. They were also like conscious people. And yet, suddenly this wall just came up between us. And I was like, what is going on here? I felt like I had woken up in the midst of sort of collective insanity. I couldn't wrap my brain around it. I became like really curious. I had this question, what is it that causes other rational and compassionate people to be so uncompassionate, essentially, to basically just stop feeling when it comes to this issue of eating animals. And I included myself in that.
Yeah.
Before I got sick and stopped eating meat and eggs and dairy, eating animals, essentially, it's like I had been exposed. I had seen those exposés on the news about investigations into slaughterhouses. I knew it was like an unpleasant truth. I had even thought about maybe I should be vegetarian, but I just hadn't really followed through. So I was a rational, compassionate person as well, who was like actively eating animals and acting against my core values, my better judgment in some ways. So ultimately led me to do a doctoral degree in psychology. And I studied broadly, I focused my studies on the psychology of what I was calling at the time nonviolence. How is it that caring, rational people participate in uncaring, irrational practices without realizing what they're doing? And then I narrowed focus for my doctoral dissertation of eating animals. And that was what led to, that was my thesis. And that thesis ended up over time becoming my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows.
Which is, I feel like, such a seminal work in this lane, because that explaining the cognitive dissonance piece, so helpful. I love using the psychology because it not takes us out of it, because it very much centers our experience and how we're dealing with these things, but it shows the bigger socialization and the bigger systematic ways these things happen. And you're like, oh, I've been a part of this. It's not that I'm this terrible person, because you start to grapple with this. I grew up hunting and fishing. And I think about that disconnect where I went home to my family dog and didn't understand the difference, right? So I also was irrational and compassionate. And the psychology in that, being able to explain it in that way, I think helps take the pressure sometimes off of that individual shame.
Yeah, it's actually a really good way to articulate it, where I really wanted to write a book, not about why people shouldn't eat animals. There were plenty of books at that time, even on the subject, bad for human health, the environment.
Right.
But I wanted to write a book about why we do in the first place. Like, why is it that those of us who actually do care about our impact on the world and on other animals, we're a lot of people who even call themselves animal lover, and they really are. Why do we nevertheless act against our values in this way and don't even realize what we're doing? Like, why do we eat chickens but not kittens? And why do we eat pigs but not dogs? And why do we eat hen's eggs but pigeon's eggs, or cow's milk, drink cow's milk but horse's milk? And why don't we ever ask why? So this was really what I wanted to look at and really give people an opportunity, because so much conversation, even back then, was framed, but not productively, as in, okay, either once people have stepped out of this way of thinking, like you're vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. And there's this very kind of like more urge to the conversation, which makes sense. This is an ethical issue, but the vast majority of people who are eating animals are not eating animals because they're bad people who don't care about animals, because they've had their psyche completely hijacked by this invisible system that they can't even see and have no control over, or have no control over until they recognize it, hence writing the book.
Can we talk a little bit more about that invisible system? Because I think this is leading into that beyond carnism and the work that you're doing there. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that for listeners if they're not familiar, and then maybe dive into that invisible system that we're operating within to take our kind of individual shame out of it.
Yeah, sure. So when I was doing my doctoral research, I had this was my question, like, how is it that we live with this weird paradoxical mentality, like this contradiction between our attitudes and our behavior? We care about animals, can't stand to see animals suffering. They cringe, they turn away, they shut down the video. And yet at the same time, we actively participate in extensive, intensive, and completely unnecessary harm to animals, voting with our dollars, basically, through our other means, hunting, fishing, meat production, and so on. For my doctoral dissertation, I interviewed vegans and vegetarians, and also mostly non-vegans, meat consumers and product consumers, I'd say, butchers, slaughterhouse workers, people who killed their own animals for food. And I heard across the board that there was this contradiction people's attitudes and behaviors when it comes to eating animals or killing animals or consuming animals, whatever, processing animals. And the widespread contradictory attitudes and behaviors, these don't exist in a vacuum. It isn't just that I happened to get 50, 100, whatever. I did actually surveys after that 150. people who all just randomly happen to have this paradoxical mentality. Like
Right.
this isn't existing, and a fact bigger is going on here. And that's what led me to identify what I came to call Carnism, which is the invisible system or ideology. It's another word for belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. And so Carnism is essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system. But the only reason that people might eat pigs but not dogs is because they do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, which is true for anybody who their food choices freely, who have the economic privilege essentially of making their food choices freely, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs, but this is visible. So people don't even realize that the behavior of eating animals reflects a deeper belief system that they never consciously signed on for. They were just born into it. And what's really important to understand about Carnism is it's not just a belief system. It's a special kind of belief system. Number one, it's a violent system. It is literally organized around violence, right? Meat cannot be procured without killing, and egg and dairy production causes extensive harm and suffering to animals. It's organized around violence. And most people would never ever willingly contribute to this kind of unnecessary, intensive violence towards. And so Carnism, nevertheless, relies on the majority of people contributing to it. And so it needs to use a set of psychological defense mechanisms. Basically, these are ways of thinking that distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our natural empathy from the animals we've learned to classify as edible. So, for example, if you were sitting down and let's say that you were not vegan, right? And you were sitting down and you were eating a juicy hamburger and your dining companion turned to you and said, hey, by the way, that hamburger is actually not made from beef. It's made from a golden retriever, right? Chances are just thought of moments ago as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you had just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And rather than continuing to eat the burger, you probably throw it in the trash and maybe even want to take to the streets in protest. Carnism distorts our perceptions of meat, eggs, and dairy, and the animals those products are procured from, so that we are so disconnected from the reality of our experience that we are not authentically experiencing it when we're eating animals, right? Your reaction to eating a golden retriever, that's your authentic reaction. That's the reaction you have when you haven't essentially been brainwashed. I would say brainwashed sounds like there's some intentionality behind this, and there isn't, but deeply conditioned. So Carnism is a dominant system and its defense mechanisms, and we can unpack them, and I can talk about exactly what these defenses are and lay out. But I want to say one other thing about Carnism. It's also what's called a dominant system. That means that the system, its tenets, its teachings are so widespread that they're invisible. They're just woven through the fabric of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. The idea that eating animals is legitimate and the right thing to do, and not just animals, but certain animals in particular, is so widespread, it shapes all of our major social institutions, family, religion, business, medicine, nutrition, the state, and so on. So when we study, we're actually studying carnistic nutrition. But we don't even recognize it because Carnism is invisible. We study carnistic nutrition. So it's really important to recognize that when we're born into a system like Carnism that's so widespread, that's dominant, and that's organized around these defense mechanisms, these ways of operating that basically prevent people from taking in any information that challenges this belief that eating animals is the right thing to do. When we're born into a system like this, we inevitably absorb that system's logic as our own. We learn to look at the world through the lens of Carnism. So all of us, whether we want to or not, as long as we're born into a dominant animal eating culture, we have very likely inherited and internalized this defensive way of thinking. And this is why a vegan can say, I'm vegan, and all of a sudden start hearing all the reasons as to why veganism is wrong, and hearing, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal, and getting attacked and getting examined and questioned and so on and so forth, or teased or whatever else may happen. So it's tricky because Carnism conditions people to feel defensive against, or I would say even reject any information that would help get them outside of this carnistic box, this way of thinking. So it's really tricky. And anyway, I just said a lot, and we can unpack these defenses if you want, but that's an overview of this system. And when vegans understand this, when people are promoting veganism or just living as vegan, understand carnism, take a huge weight off your shoulders, because you start, oh my God, no wonder I'm up against all fences. No wonder I'm getting teased. Once you can see it clearly for what it is, you don't get stuck in this of justifications, like back and forth in argumentation, and you realize the defensive, the nature of the beast, and I'm going to use strategies to bypass these defenses.
It gives me more empathy sometimes too. One, always importantly, remembering I was not born this way. This is a journey of undoing a lot of social conditioning, and this is one piece in that journey for me. But it gives me empathy in realizing that we are the product of our conditionings and oppressive systems. Oh, that's where this is coming from. It's not personal. It's actually not about me usually.
Yeah, and that's really important to keep in mind, because for many people who become vegan will say that becoming vegan was one of the most important and empowering choices of their lives. They find that their sense of empowerment and inspiration quickly turns to shock when they discover that their relationships are breaking down because of this, because they weren't expecting it. It would be like, and this disconnection, humans, and I'm sure animals as well, or at least certain other animals, we are to avoid the pain of disconnection. It's very hard to feel connection with somebody who is deeply resistant to something that is profoundly important to you, where there is this sort of like defensive dynamic going on, and then the vegan gets defensive, and then the non-vegan gets more defensive. Things can escalate from there. But when you really, number one, understand that, when you understand carnism, you can understand that good people can participate in harmful practices and it doesn't make them bad people. And that can be a big relief. And we can talk more about that later if you want. And when you see clearly in a couple of my books, I've on Why We Love Dogs, but also in my book that I released, which is a guide to improving relationships and communications among vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters, I really break down and unpack this whole set of ecological defenses so that they're not a mystery anymore. They're not invisible anymore. It's okay, here's what's happening. This is what happens when vegans get projected upon in this particular way. And then to your point, you take it less personally. You can see defense for what it is. And once people can see defense mechanisms, psychological distortions like this, these defense mechanisms lose some of their power, and sometimes a lot of their power. And maybe I can examples for listeners who are like, okay, already, what the hell are you talking about with defenses?
Yeah.
So one defense mechanism is, I call it abstraction or de-individualization. The name is actually not important, right? So for example, I call this these carnistic. We learn to see farmed animals as abstractions, meaning as lacking any individuality or any personality of their own. So we learn to think that and all pigs are the same. Distancing mechanism. It's a mechanism that makes it easier to eat pigs, right? And we don't do this when it comes to dogs and certain other animals that we have not been socialized to be so disconnected from. Another example is objectification, right? So we learn to refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone. Another example of a distancing mechanism. Another example is justification, right? And in order to eat animals, we have to feel justified in eating animals. And the justification is we tend to learn that the myths of eating animals, facts of eating animals, right? Wow. And one way by learning, believe in this mythology. There's a vast mythology surrounding and supporting or justifying the eating of animals, but all of these myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And when you think about it, these same myths have been used, or the same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history.
I feel like so many things go down to those like 3 N's. They'll all be boiled down to that.
Yeah, exactly. And they really can. And these 3 N's, eating animals as normal, natural, and necessary, have been used to uphold violent practices throughout human history. And what's really, and they are myths that are presented as facts. They're taught to us in school, in university, and disseminated throughout society as though they're facts, but they're not. They are just a widely held set of opinions, the opinions of the dominant animal eating culture that we have inherited and have not been sufficiently really critically examined to be seen as the myths that they are. And carnism is an ism. It's structured like other, or I would call unjust systems, right? Let me back up and just say not to compare the victim of the violence of unjust systems, right? The experience of each set of victims will always be unique. Even though it's important not to compare the experience of the victims, I believe it's fundamentally important to recognize that the systems that allow for or lead to the victimization are structurally similar. And the mentality that drives these systems and the violence is identical. The very same mentality that drives us to widespread slaughter toward farmed animals is the mentality that causes us to contribute to genocides against humans and all sorts of other atrocities in the world. It's really important. If we fail to pick out the common threads that are woven in these violent practices and systems, we're just going to keep trading one form of violence for another. Eradicate violence toward one group, but as long as we have the same mindset intact, because we feel like it's appropriate that it's appropriate to carry out the violence to another group, we're just going to keep reenacting the problem.
I'm so glad you said that, because as talking about the different defenses and where this socialization is coming from, I was thinking it feels like we could insert so many different unjust systems in this place and talk in the same way, depending on the person and what privilege they hold, their reactions, and then how to talk about that system. It feels not, of course, universal across the board, but it feels like a very similar situation.
Yeah, and you're totally right. After I had finished my doctoral research and I had coded and looked at, named and broken down the different psychological defense mechanisms and looked at the structures and the pillars of the system and how the system is based on other really important research that had been done by people who were looking at the side of prejudice and related issues, I realized had not just identified carnism, but that there was a blueprint for oppressive systems. I would call them rather unjust systems in general. A couple of years ago, a book called How to End Injustice Everywhere. And it basically does what I did with Why We Love Dogs and applying it broadly to unjust systems more generally. And it really, I think it's really important when we talk about social change, when we talk about creating a better world, we have to come at it from multiple, really important to look at the role of economics. It's really use the lens of philosophy, and a key perspective that's been missing, not entirely missing, but largely unrepresented, has been psychology. And this is like, okay, so at the end of the day, we are psychological beings, and these institutions and philosophy and economic systems is made of individuals, and individuals are at our hearts psychological beings. So we really need to understand mindset driving all of this so that we can really target some of the roots of the problems.
When you started doing this work, were you already interested in psychology? Was that already the plan, or is it really this question that made you want to figure that out and dive in?
Both. So I was always very interested in psychology, but the plan was to become an educator, which I degree was in my master's in education, and I was planning to do a PhD in education. My first love is education. I'm very passionate about the education system. And then I decided to pursue a PhD in psychology because of this, because I realized I loved psychology and be a psychologist and work with people. And then I decided to go into education because I felt like I could make more of a difference in the world through education. And it was like, wait a minute, I actually had been giving, like this was years ago, right? This is like early 90s or something. I had been giving classes in like community center in vegetarianism at the time. And there was like a cooking instructor with me. And we were like, I think it was like Boston Community Center, and we'd have like 20 people come in, they'd learn, and I'd give little talks. And I think I was showing like John Robbins' Diet for a New America. And what I discovered is that people would, wow, this is great. You could eat really well. And this is so important. and didn't really stick. Like they didn't really change. Discovered that people could be totally on board with the message and nevertheless revert back to eating out.
Why do you think that happens?
I think that there are not tools. They don't have enough tools in place. There's not enough social reinforcement. At least that's what some people stop being, because it's just too hard for them socially. A lot of different reasons, but I found that really, I had very interested in psychology. And then I decided, oh my God, education alone is not enough. I need to really understand the mind. And meanwhile, I had been very fueled by this illness that I had developed somewhere along the line, somewhere within this whole process. So that was really the key, laid it in my mind before that, to go really under psychology better so I could understand what would help shift people's way of thinking and drive behavioral change.
Another book that you put out is The Vegan Matrix. And I love the conversations that you bring to the forefront about privilege and the nuances there, right? Something you don't always get on social media turns out is nuance, right? So it just becomes all of these dichotomies, like you said in the beginning, like it's this moral thing. You either are or you aren't, you're bad or you're good. But I think one of the things about a lot of the work you've done, but specifically the work on that too, is talked about there's so much nuance within the movement, within these unjust systems that give people different access and different information to making change.
Yeah, definitely. And it is, and you're so right, the way that you frame it. And this is a big problem, one of many problems, but it's a big problem with using social media, is that social media is like essentially designed at this point, algorithms, to create us versus them. It's designed to dysregulate people, and dysregulation, when you're dysregulated, that means your nervous system is, and for listeners who are not sure what I'm talking about, just think about opening your email and getting some heading in all caps with 5 exclamation points after it. Chances are, like Lance,
I was going to say, I'm dysregulated.
So we're in and out of dysregulation all the time, to a greater or lesser degree. And dysregulation exists on the spectrum, and you can be or dysregulated. Regardless, studies have shown that when we're dysregulated, we actually have less access to rational faculties. We are less able to think rationally, and we have less connection with our empathy. And so here we have social media that dysregulates us, that is designed to cultivate dysregulating emotions, the emotions of anger, moral outrage, hate, and people use media as a form to talk about very delicate, sensitive, life or death, morally low charged issues. I think that's actually going to work. And it's not. People, like, you can't even avoid fighting when you disagree about what to get for your nephew's 11th birthday on social media. Like, people devolve into horrible fights. So we possibly have a conversation eating animals or social justice. Not to say we shouldn't use social media to be promoting ideas, but trying to have any kind of nuanced conversation, just not the forum for it.
Right. It makes it really difficult to figure out how to communicate effectively. I would love to hear more from you about, in terms of, okay, so we're hearing, here are these defensives. Here's what happens with carnism, with a lot of other isms, right? So then how does someone who wants to talk about these things, care about these things, how do we communicate effectively to maybe make people shut down less?
That's the $1 million question. And in my opinion, one of the most important questions that we could be asking and need to be asking and doing something about. Through my personal journey of like really exploring the psychology of essentially like injustice and social transformation, I really on this realization, I should say, that the foundation of many of these problems, many foundations, but a key foundation or any of the problems facing the world today is an inability to relate in a way that's healthy. So if you look at war and poverty, racism, patriarchy, speciesism, carnism, domestic abuse or violence, toxic places, whatever, see that they share a common denominator of relational dysfunction or dysfunctional ways of relating. So whether we're relating as social groups or two social being to each other, we're relating to members of our own family, whether we're relating to people within our own social movement, that we want to have infighting. When we relate in a way that's not skillful or healthy, we create the opposite outcomes of what we want. And so relational dysfunction is many of the problems in our world today. And therefore, what I call relational literacy, which is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating, is a key driver to help transform all of these problems. Now, the primary way we relate is through communication. Communication is the primary way we relate. So when we learn to improve our communication and skillful communication, and when we learn like the foundation of relational literacy, we can literally transform our personal lives. We can transform our relationships. We can transform the groups that we're a part of. And ultimately, when us do this, we can transform our world. The beautiful thing about all of this is that it doesn't matter what point of entry you come at this issue from, whether you want to build relational literacy because your organization operate more efficiently, or your movement, or because you're struggling with your like romantic partner in your relationship. It's the same set of skills. And once you build relational literacy in one area, it spills out into other areas. Relational literacy, to get to really some practical points, relational literacy is made up of many principles and tools, but they're all based on this one key sort of formula for healthy relating. It applies to how we relate to other animals, to the environment, to ourselves. We're always relating to ourselves through our self-talk and through the choices that we make that impact our future selves, right? It applies to long-term relationships as well as interactions. And here's the formula for healthy relating. In a healthy interaction, communication, what practice integrity and we honor dignity. And practicing integrity means, I'm just going to break this down. We practice respect. We treat the other person or ourselves the way that we would want to be treated if we were in their position. So to simplify that even further, we practice compassion towards them. Mm-hmm. So you practice integrity and honor dignity. When you honor someone's dignity, that means you think of them and treat them as though they are as worthy of being treated with compassion, respect, as you or anybody else on this planet. No matter who they are, no matter what they've done. This doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable for problematic behaviors. It means we do not look down on them and see them as fundamentally less than. This is the mentality that seeing somebody as fundamentally less worthy of compassion than others is the heart of all of the problems, the relationally dysfunctional problems we've talked about. So when you practice the formula for healthy relating, you practice integrity, you're practicing compassion, and this is you acting on your core moral value of compassion and fairness, treating somebody with respect. We practice integrity and we honor dignity. And this leads to a sense of connection and security. So if you think about a great relationship or a relationship in your life, chances are you trust that individual honors your dignity and that they treat you with respect. And chances are you feel secure and connected with them. And if you think of a relationship in your life that's not good, chances are you feel that person violates their integrity when they interact with you and they harm your dignity. You can sense that that they feel like you're not worthy of being treated with respect and compassion. And you feel disconnected and insecure around them. Of course, this exists on the spectrum. You can be more or less, healthy and relational, or unhealthy and non-relational. So this formula for healthy relating, this is the foundation of interaction. Now, when you apply this to communication, basically what that means is that when you're communicating with somebody, there are lots and lots of amazing, and I'll share some, I know you have some resources actually you can share based on what I listed in my book, and I'll share some with you today if you want, for effective communication skills. Healthy communication, right? Every communication that we have is made up of two parts, content and the process. The content, right? So the content of this communication right now is communication. The process is how we're communicating. Most people tend to overfocus on the content and think, I've just got to get all my words right. I've got to string my sentence together in the right way. And they underfocus on the process, but the process matters much more. The process determines how we feel in a communication. So if you think, for example, about a conversation you had like maybe 6 months or a year ago, say you were like out at a dinner or something, you're just talking to a person sitting next to you, there's a good chance that you have entirely forgotten the content. You don't even remember what you talked about, but you probably still remember how you felt. The process determines how you feel. And when our process is healthy, we can talk about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy, we can't talk about anything without arguing. People who are like on the same page all the time, but they still seem to be able to like argue with each other, that's probably because they have an unhealthy process. So in a healthy process, we practice the formula, of course, and there is more to that. In us, our goal is not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong. It's not to win, which means to make the other person lose.
Fine, Melanie, fine.
You can want to share your opinion, but your goal needs to be mutual understanding.
Yeah.
When your goal is mutual understanding, and you can tell when you're talking to somebody, if you're talking to somebody and the objective of the conversation from their end is to be right and make you wrong and prove that you're wrong, you're probably going to be fairly shut down to what they have to say. The only reason we communicate in the first place is because we're not mind readers. The whole goal of communication, feel a need. That's it. It doesn't mean you can't have an important opinion you want to share. You have that opinion. And it just means that your first goal needs to be mutual understanding. And if you can shift into that, you notice you're getting combative and you can shift into that, miracles can happen. Now, the thing is, when you learn effective communication strategies, one of the nice things is not just that you can communicate so much more effectively. I'm giving you the tiniest iceberg here. There are some incredible tools out there. The other thing is that you can identify when other people are not communicating effectively, right? And that's hard. How many times have you had a conversation with somebody and you don't know why? You can't put your finger on why, but you just feel a little bit small after the conversation. It's such a bad feeling, but you can't put your finger on it. You just feel a little bit less than. When you really understand and have unpacked these things, of course, that person was defining my reality. They were making themselves the expert on my experience by telling me that I'm overreacting, or I shouldn't be feeling the way that I'm feeling, or I don't recognize my deeper motivations, but they do. That's defining reality. That's fundamentally disrespectful. It happens all the time. Most people don't know it. They can't identify it. They walk away from a communication where that's happened to them and they just feel crappy and less than and don't know why. And there are lots of reasons that this can happen in a conversation, but once you can put your finger on it, you're in a position to actually rectify it and address it during the communication. Usually the other person doesn't even know that they're doing it. Just to protect yourself.
Maybe this is a little me trying to make myself feel better, but I'm also thinking of listeners and all of us, right? That are now moments where you've been the person making someone feel that way, right? Whether it's relating to veganism or not, I have undoubtedly made people feel shitty in conversations. I know that. And I also can think very specifically in the beginning of my vegan journey, which is very classic, right? That I was just like, holy shit, everybody, listen to me. And sometimes I do like to honor that there's all these different places in me where sometimes I'm coming at it with compassion, and sometimes I'm coming at it with rage, and sometimes I'm coming at it with feeling overwhelmed for our future, all of those things, but the how we're communicating, because all of that is the same what. All of that is the same, this is really important, but the how part is really big. And also that we're still learning how to do this. Like we're still learning how to communicate with our friends, let alone with people we want to share this message with. And while you were talking about all that, it made me think, why do some of the things Melanie's talking about right now feel like they'd be easier with strangers than with some of our closest family and friends? Some of those conversations, I'm like, I could meet someone down the street right now and they could ask me, and I feel like I could pretty articulate nicely, calmly, why I want them to, if they're asking questions, a family member or a close friend, that feels harder sometimes.
You have a lot less investment, and you also don't have an entire history of dynamics and misunderstandings and hurt feelings and whatever else behind you and various roles you've played together. It makes sense. And I'm really glad that you shared this kind of questioning that you have. Oh my God, how many? A lot of times be born under the sign of human. And it is, so it's really important. And this is practicing the formula to yourself, right? You treat yourself with compassion and respect. Perfectionism it's not compassionate to oneself. Many of us do it. People who are drawn to making the world a better place tend to be more perfectionistic in some ways, or perfectionistic in some ways, but Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the. I often say that we all, unfortunately, have no choice but to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use. And yet none of us gets a single formal lesson in how to relate in a way that's communicate effectively. You look at these problems facing the world, they are not problems that are the result of not enough people knowing how to do geometry. So all of us are just like, we do the best with what we have, and we stumble forward one foot at a time with like virtually no guidance. So if you look back on your life and you say, wow, oops, didn't practice there, oops, defined reality here, that's like normal. Everybody does that, because how could you not without having learned and trained and practiced? And yeah, when I look at the state of the world and just how dysregulated so many of us are so much of the time, which like how can it be? And the fact that most of us have never learned what dysregulation is, how to identify it in ourselves, right? We don't even know when we're dysregulated. And so we end up spilling out like dysregulation is contagious. Right? Dysregulated people dysregulate people. When you're around somebody, that person who sent you the email, all caps and exclamation points, was clearly dysregulated or likely dysregulated when they did that, and they paid it forward. And that's what happens. And we don't get taught how to identify this feeling or how to self-regulate or how to help other people co-regulate. We just have to like stumble through life like the best we know how. And I'm like amazed that people get out of bed in the morning, given what we've been born into, a relationally dysfunctional mess of a world. And yet somehow we keep doing it and getting up and getting out of bed and even trying to make the world a better, which is very inspiring. I wanted to say that I have a website. We have a relatively new website. It's in.org, and it's a website with a lot of information to help people identify infighting and to provide tools to remedy the problem. And everything that we have talked about here today, because we've been talking about healthy relating and communication, is on that website. So I have books on the subject, but I put a lot on that website so it would be easy access for people.
I appreciate the work you've been doing and talking about vegan infighting more and more, because it reminds me of how easily we get distracted in terms of what's the goal. I could say that about my own self with my life or in the big picture, right? Of course. But just in terms of if we're fighting with each other, instead of fighting these unjust systems, we are spinning our wheels, right? And that's not to say we're going to do it perfectly, or people can't be critiqued or invited in different ways or advance and learn. But the more we're just pissed off at each other, these unjust systems are like, dope, it's working just as we planned.
Spinning our wheels, we're putting our wheels in reverse, right? We're like really counterproductive. And it's true. And you can have a couple who has the shared goal of a happy, connected relationship, and yet are with each other. Often antithetical to that goal. Same thing. It's just as people don't have the tools, the awareness and the tools. And so all of the tools that are designed to help reduce infighting among vegans and other advocates are the same to reduce fighting and conflict in couples and in families and in workplaces, just relational skills. There's some unique elements that play to fighting among vegans, and that's on the website, of course. On the deepest level, though, it is all these relational tools and skills.
Which I feel like brings us back to almost where we started in the station, just feeling like learning the unjust systems, learning about the socialization, learning about communication, relating to each other as humans is so helpful in taking the shame and the blame that is really easy to fall into when we learn about how we're partaking in these systems, and move from just staying in that place, which causes me to be depressed, into action. And I feel like that's the beautiful part, right? If you have knowledge, you can actually take some action versus being like, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. That's true. And you can also, when you have knowledge, it also helps you, like you were saying about learning about Carnism, right? When you have knowledge about relationality and these things we've been talking about, you can also, rather than judging, like you were saying, judging non-vegans doesn't get you anywhere. It just causes pain in your life. It reduces the effectiveness of and then judging yourself does the same thing. and really understanding relational tools and being able to apply them to yourself. Your primary relationship is with yourself, and being able to practice the formula to yourself and know that every one of us is like, every single one of us is nothing more and nothing less than the hardwiring and biology we were born with, and every single experience we've had on a basis throughout our lives. Like, we can't be more or less than that. So when we expect somebody, including ourselves, to be different from who and how we are, it's like expecting a tree that's been rained on not to be wet. It doesn't mean that you can't say, okay, here I am at this moment in my life, and I want to move forward in a particular way. It's simply to say that you are here at this moment in your life because of where you were at 5 minutes ago, because of where you were, and so on and so forth. And to blame somebody, we can hold people accountable, including ourselves, and say, I want to change these behaviors. I want to improve. I want to be more skillful. And I can do that without looking down, thinking that somehow I'm a bad person or something's wrong with me, because not. Like, if I had been born into Hitler's brain and body and life, I wouldn't be Melanie Joy talking to you today. I would have been Adolf Hitler doing what Adolf Hitler's doing. There's nothing special or unique about some substance, like some entity in this body that I'm talking from, that makes me special. It's just, I am who I am because of where I came from. We can really recognize that. It takes so much of the shame. Working with shame could be a whole episode and 10 episodes, but it can really destigmatize us and help us feel compassion for ourselves.
I appreciate that. I could talk to you about this stuff for longer, but I want to be thoughtful of your time, and maybe we can connect again in the future for a part 2, because I'm only halfway through my notes. But I do want to talk to you and just ask how you are taking care of yourself. How do you stay hopeful and move forward when you're studying something that is so beautiful and helping people advance, and also you're looking at the reality of the world all the time, and sometimes that can be overwhelming. So what do you do to take care of yourself in this world?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think that self-care is really undervalued. It's talked about a lot these days, but among people who are active, people tend to really self-neglect. Super important. So one of the things I do is I'm very careful not to overwitness. Don't expose myself to distressing information if I can avoid it. I'll take in distressing information if I absolutely have to, and otherwise I don't. And I think people need to give themselves permission. Don't look at the graphic imagery. Don't look at the horrible videos. Just, you don't need to do that. It's not helping the cause. It's just helping the cause, then do it. But if it's not clearly helping the cause because you're not a cover investigator or something, you're probably just feeding your trauma, and that's not going to help the movement. So have healthy boundaries. Don't overwitness. Sometimes I don't feel hopeful. Most of the time I do, and sometimes I don't. And I think it's okay for people to give themselves permission. Like, a lot of working toward change, you feel, oh my God, I have to be on the bright side, and saying there's reason to hope. And maybe we're not going to make it. And we can't project into the future. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. There are too many moving parts happening right now. I remind Harris said recently, and Sam Harris is one of the ways that I take care of myself. Actually, I want to really recommend his podcast, his app, Waking Up. Hope is the feeling of wishing that things were different. And it's okay. We don't want violence in time if we give ourselves to accept who and how and where we are now without feeling like we have to fight it and make ourselves feel better and make ourselves feel happier. It just makes it easier to get through the day without that resistance. This is what Buddha teaches. So sometimes I don't feel hopeful, and I give myself permission not to always have to feel hopeful and to be carrying, because as advocates, we often feel like we have to carry the beacon in front of us and lead the charge forward. That's a heavy burden to carry. Sometimes you're going to be sad. Sometimes it's going to be hard. Just accept yourself without judging and thinking things should be different. And that's okay. And honor, I'm also very committed to my own regulation, and I have information about this on infighting.org. If you make your regulation living a life in balance, feel regulated as often as possible, ideally very frequently, it's not going to be all the time, your life will change. Give yourself permission to prioritize your own regulation, self-regulation, to prioritize having a balanced nervous system. And it's one of the best things you can do if you want to make the world a better place. It'll help you be sustainable, and it'll help you help others much more effectively. And apart from other sort of self-care things, like trying to be really careful with my working out and being as healthy as I can. And again, I don't want to add to-dos to people's lists, but taking care of helps you take care of others. I meditate and practice, use Sam Harris's app called Waking Up. And I highly recommend it. People can get it you don't have to pay any. And it does provide, as I don't know if he uses these exact words, but I think he does something like this, help you create a new operating system for your mind.
I love that. I really appreciate that because I think, like you said, self-care is so undervalued and it's been codified, right? And
Totally.
again, for another episode, the capitalist system and vegan capitalism and all that stuff, but it's been commodified, right? And not that I don't love a bubble bath moment or whatever. Self-care seems like this hour spa day, and that's supposed to have your point of actually self-care is regulating the body in whatever way and finding what works for you and your clear connecting point to how that helps the world. We know taking care of ourselves, it makes sense. You're like, yeah, if I take care of myself, the world better. But that's such a good concrete example of saying, well, if I'm regulated and I'm coming to communication with a regulated self, how much further that conversation can go, or that moment can go, that class can go, that meeting can go, versus if I'm showing up dysregulated. And again, not striving for perfection because we don't have time for that. But that is really, I think, such a beautiful way to show there's the clear connection between all of us right there. One clear connection of how taking care of ourselves really does benefit the collective.
Yeah, totally. That's very well said. And I would add, and right about the commodification of self-care. Self-care is very often looked at individualistically. What can I do for me and myself? And number one, it is, as you said, there are many ways that self-care contributes to a better world. And an important part of self-care is cultivating healthy relationships. When you build relational skills, it helps you cultivate fulfilling connected relationships, and people are more resilient when they're in fulfilling connected relationships. And the more you can be a part of a community, and that community doesn't have to be big, one person or two people who really understand you, that you can be yourself with, who can help you self-regulate and help you be who you want to be in this world, can make a big difference. Really glad that you brought that up. And I would say with the Wake Up app also, there is people who can't afford the app can apply the app for free, not something that is only reserved for a certain income or an income.
Beautiful. I did not know that.
And it's another reason I like it.
Yeah, that's not something you see often in those spaces. So that's really beautiful. Is there anything else you wanted to share with listeners that I didn't give you space to do?
Next time when we have 5 hours, we can come back to it. But we are, beyond Carnism, my organization, we are a service organization. We are in service of people who are working to create a better outcome. Everything that I do and everything that we do is to support people who are doing important work in the world. And so avail yourself of our services. We have lots of everything that is free.
It's so true. It's such a wealth of resources. Loved some of the online calls and presentations. Yeah, it's really so people can check all of the things out that we've been talking about.
Great. All right. Thank you. You're a pleasure to talk to, easy to talk to. So next time, let's do this for half a day or so.
That sounds great for me. Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate you being here and sharing all of that and just helping all of us figure out how to do this work. It's very appreciated.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode of Consciously Clueless. And for that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, tag me when you share in social media, or share this episode with others who may be interested in the topic. Any sharing truly means the world to me. Join the community at patreon.com/consciouslycarly for bonus podcast content like smoke sessions with Consciously Cannabis guests, video versions of solo episodes, monthly live calls, one-to-one support, more lifestyle content, mindfulness resources, and more. Until next time, stay consciously clueless.